One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day. Welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you a conversation from our popular webinar series. This week we spoke to retired Admiral Chris Barrie, former Chief of the Australian Defence Force and Honorary Professor at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. We talked to him about the need for real leadership to tackle the profound security implications of global warming for this country. He was in conversation with Richie Merzian, Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. This was recorded live on Wednesday the 24th of March 2022, and things may have changed since recording. Chris, I'll put my first question to you. Since the recent flood crisis, there have been many calls for more support from the ADF on the ground to affected communities, but you've warned that Australia is already pretty dependent on the ADF. Whose responsibility do you think responding to climate-induced natural disasters should be?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, Ebony, in the sense that in the past, the Defence Force has provided assistance to the civil community on an as-available basis. But we were talking about conditions under which there were long gaps between events. On nearly every occasion, if we weren't off fighting somewhere, there was ADF personnel available to go and assist. But I think it's important over the events of the last 3 years to consider the real issues here. The Black Summer of bushfires, Shane Fitzsimmons, who was the Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales, he had out in the field 78,000 volunteers. Now, our Defence Force is about 62,000 personnel. And of those, some of them are very highly technical specialities. And the ADF at best can't put more than about 6,000 to 7,000 people in the field. So that's a paltry number compared to the kinds of numbers that Shane had out in the field. And that's not even thinking about what they did in Queensland and Victoria. So the scale is an issue. The second part of it, of course, is that ADF personnel are very highly trained. They're probably the most expensive workforce we have in this country because of the investment we have got to make in their skills and capabilities. And to use them in this way is okay on a space available occasion, but we're starting to see now calls for the ADF to turn out all the time and to go and assist communities. And I understand at community level, having uniforms on the ground is important, and I think our people do a terrific job. I've yet to talk to somebody in the ADF who didn't appreciate why they were there, what they had to try and do, and so on and so forth. And that seeing a uniform on the ground that appears to know what they're doing does give communities some, if you like, confidence that it'll be okay in the end. But we can't go on doing it because it means that when sailor soldiers and airmen go home to have a break, now they're called out to do these other things. So on top of their military tasks, now they're doing these community-led tasks, and that becomes an impossible equation eventually. And we know that Minister Dutton has announced he's going to get another 18,500 people in the Defence Force, and oh, by the way, he's going to change the conditions of service. The only thing I can say to that is good luck. Because in my 6 years at the top of the Defence Force, we were always 10 to 15% short of people to do work.
Right. That's a big gap. I did just want to bring up earlier today, you were in Parliament House with other security leaders calling on all Australian political parties to make the security risks posed by climate change a key focus in the upcoming federal election and to commit to a comprehensive climate security risk assessment. Could you please explain why you think that's essential and how a future government might go about undertaking such an assessment?
That's a terrific question. Thanks, Ebony. I want to start at the beginning for me anyway, and that was back in 2008 when I was asked to become involved at the Climate Change Institute at ANU. Before I agreed to go on board as a member of the expert advisory panel, I did some homework. I did my research. The more I read, the more concerned I became. And there were a number of articles and books out there which just said to me, this is a very, very big issue. So since 2008, I've worked with the Climate Commission, then the Climate Council. I've been part of the CCI. I've done presentations. I've given lectures at the National Security College, and so on and so forth. And I've trailed around the nation giving talks on climate change at various venues. Early last year, when the coming together of our failure to do anything of manifest ability over the last 20 years to do much about climate change and its consequences, the prospect of the Conference of the Party 26 in Glasgow, some of us put our heads together and said, you know what, we've had enough. It's time to stop pussyfooting around on the issues of climate change and consequences and go out there and to tell it like it is. And that led to the production of the Missing in Action report, where we really accused the leadership of the federal government of being missing in action and doing anything about the sorts of things that we were seeing. And we invested effort in trying to make sure that the Australian government would go to Glasgow with something meaningful. Well, we know that didn't work. And if I was to paraphrase what Antonio Guterres said 3 days ago, he called out Australia as a missing in action country. He talked about climate change, and he talked about the results of Glasgow being naive in terms of its ability to make any real difference to the planetary consequences we're thinking about. And that's another reason why we're doing what we're doing. We want to plain speak about the issues, and we want to convince people that this forthcoming election is the most important election I can think about in my voting life, because the parliament that assembles after this next election will have the responsibility for doing the climate risk assessment and security assessment. And from that will flow the setting of priorities, the allocating of resources, the establishment of a plan, and harnessing the energies of the nation to do something about it.
It's such a huge and important issue. Richie, I wonder if I might come to you next. Before you joined the Australia Institute, I know you worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and you've represented Australia at UN climate negotiations on the issue of adaptation. What does the United Nations say about preparing for climate impacts, and has Australia listened?
Yeah, I spent a number of years with the role of leading on adaptation for the Australian government, and it was a really useful way of seeing firsthand how other countries engaged in this issue. For smaller nations, for less wealthy nations, this is front and center. Like, you have small island states, when they get hit by some of these climate impacts, it wipes away almost a year's worth of GDP or more. So huge consequences that they can't just bounce back from. And so what you saw firsthand is, of the 200 or so countries around the table, you had the majority who took climate seriously and the impact seriously. And so one role that we had there was to actually outline a structure that countries could adopt, a national adaptation plan. And I had the privilege of being asked to chair these negotiations with my counterpart from the Maldives. And we managed to actually outline a plan for how countries go ahead and undertake a national adaptation plan, something that, despite helping to shape globally, Australia has never done at home. In fact, the Australian government funds these national adaptation plans in the Pacific. It will often talk to the importance of them, and yet it won't actually undertake the steps here, which is this a real shame, because it means that we don't know how vulnerable we are to climate impacts, which allows us to get away with the question of the cost of climate impacts versus the cost of action, which has often been this inane conversation we've had in numerous federal elections. And it's left us vulnerable and lurching from one response to the next, when the majority of countries around the world have now undertaken these national adaptation plans. Over 70% of OECD wealthy countries have undertaken these national adaptation plans, and Australia doesn't have anything in that place. If anything, the federal government appears to push this responsibility down to states and local governments, who are far less able to actually do the homework and fund the responses necessary.
Well, that raises a number of interesting questions for me, because we talked about the ADF being able to respond at community level in Australia, but the ADF also trains to do humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in our region. So when Cyclone Pam hits the Philippines, guess who goes to help the people in the Philippines? Is the ADF, or to the small islands in the Pacific. That's where we go, even with the recent volcano in Tonga, for example. So it's extraordinary that we're missing in action here in Australia, where it's the security of our own people that we ought to be concerned about. And worse than that, as Richie points out, we've not learned anything from being involved in the processes of putting these adaptation plans together. It's almost like the leadership seat is absolutely vacant at the moment. And I think this ought to concern all of us.
It certainly should. And I guess to come back to you, Chris, we've seen, the recent flooding disasters all across the east coast of Australia, with Lismore in particular, seem to be really taken by surprise by the intensity and the level of the flooding event there. And it's only been a couple of years since the Black Summer bushfires, which once again engulfed most of the east coast of Australia. Obviously, we have extreme weather events and climate-fueled disasters occurring around the rest of the country as well. But it seems to me a lot of the effort is spent just responding to disasters and far less on preventing them or preempting them. Could you just tell us a little bit about the challenge of preparedness and scenario planning as opposed to disaster response? How does Australia go compared to how other countries prepare for these kinds of things?
Look, that picks up on what I've just said about the HADR tasks the ADF does. They actually do rehearse and train for doing that sort of stuff in somebody else's country, but it seems we don't do it here. It's also interesting now to focus on a question I was asked this morning up at Parliament House. The 2019 election, the ALP had a climate platform and they didn't win the election. What's really changed? Well, what's really changed is the Black Summer of bushfires, the pandemic, and the floods. And to paraphrase the problem of the floods in Lismore, I was speaking late last week with somebody who is in Lismore, and he sent me a piece of paper over the weekend. And, this is what he writes to me. This is the third 1 in 100 year flood in less than 5 years in Lismore. That's not 1 in 100 years. That's 3 in 5 years. That's 1 every 2 years. And the services are not working collaboratively with communities in a way that lives and businesses can be protected. So this is the issue. As we said in the Missing in Action report, we need to prevent, in the first instance, the consequences of climate change impacts. Then we need to prepare to deal with those things we haven't been able to prevent. And then finally, we have to be able to protect our communities. And this is a fundamental security responsibility for the federal government. And it's why we are saying today the next election is so important, because the members of the parliament that we elect in May are going to have to deal with this in the 3-year term of this parliament, because if they don't, the game is over.
Yeah. Richie, it is quite a short time frame, but it does seem like that climate disaster bill, just to stick with, I guess, the Lismore floods and those impacts for the moment, that bill just keeps growing. It was a huge kind of bill for the Black Summer bushfires. Now we've got these floods, which kind of no one escapes. And it's on those front lines that, it seems like the public are ultimately paying for these disasters in the end, either through ad hoc levies that we sometimes imposed or through increased insurance premiums. But I know the Australia Institute has been advocating an additional source of revenue, an alternative source of revenue. Can you just talk to me a little bit about a climate disaster levy?
It's clear that because we don't know how vulnerable we are to climate impacts, we can't prepare for them, which means that we can't figure out exactly how to even cover the costs that are a result of responding to, let alone the costs involved in preparing for it. So if you think about the 2011 Queensland floods, the government response to pay for the bill was an ad hoc tax on everyone to cover that bill. What you often see is those on the front lines are the ones who pay, and then the Australian public pays through disaster response payments, or through increased premiums that we'll all have to carry, or in just the general bills that go in terms of preparation. Those who don't pay, which we keep banging on about here at the Australian Institute, are the actual companies that profit from climate change, those who extract and sell fossil fuels. We know fossil fuels are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and yet polluters have no responsibility to pay in Australia. And so the Australian Institute's proposed a $1 levy on the embedded emissions in every tonne of coal and gas that Australia exports. With that, we can raise at least $1.5 billion every year that goes into a bucket that we can then spend on these relief arrangements, but more importantly, to help adapt and prepare and minimize the impact. What we found with the most recent polling, which we just carried out in the last 2 weeks, is that 67% of Australians support this national disaster levy on fossil fuel exports. Because if anyone should be contributing to the bill, it's those who are profiting from the cause. And that really comes down to fossil fuel companies. And if you wonder why Australian fossil fuel companies are responsible, well, Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Russia and Saudi Arabia. That's the company it keeps. These companies don't pay much by way of tax. They don't employ many Australians, if you look at the numbers like we have, and they're not paying anything for the pollution they cause. We think that should change, and this is a good place to start.
And Richie, how much of a problem is it, that idea of insurance? Because, you know, as we said, premiums rise. We've heard a lot of stories, whether it's bushfires in WA or floods in the East Coast, where people just, insurance is unaffordable.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see more and more of these red zones.
Yeah, and I've got a piece of paper in front of me from my insurance broker that says insurers look to recover their large losses from over recent years. And this translates to between 15 to 30% increases in lower risk residential schemes and between 20 to 40%, and rates can vary depending on the underwriters, for lower risk commercial and industrial risks. Unfortunately, and this is the kicker, unfortunately, the market indication is for much higher increases, 30 to 75% for plans with higher risk profiles. So what do I read into that? If you live in Lismore, you may not be able to get insurance cover for your property. And if you can't get insurance cover, you can't have a bank loan. I know in the Brisbane floods of a shopping mall that was uninsured, to the surprise of its tenants. So this issue of insurance and trying to cover off on how they can still make a business of it's really important. And what's fascinating, Ebony, is that in the Australian newspaper today, where we've published our open letter to our future political leaders, immediately opposite is a statement from the Insurance Council of Australia calling on the federal government to do something about our infrastructure because the assets are going to become uninsurable.
And just to add to that, Ebony, the government's response has been to come in as a reinsurer. So currently there's a bill before Parliament. The federal government wants to allocate about $10 billion, I believe, to a reinsurance facility in North Queensland for cyclones. So that's just one impact in one vulnerable area where it now appears that the federal government will have to play a role in insuring insurance companies. And we've already heard from one of the government members that will hopefully be expanded into other areas as well. So not only will Australians pay in terms of the disaster relief and their higher premiums, they might actually have to move in as an insurer of last resort in a more formal capacity. And we've seen how badly this plays out overseas. And this is all a flow and impact, right? Because we don't know how vulnerable we are. We go ahead and we develop in areas and expand our developments in areas that we shouldn't be developing in. And then these impacts hit and then private insurance pulls out and the federal government then has to step in and respond. So all these things build on each other. It's like a decade of inaction is now coming home to roost.
And I was asked a question this morning about the budget for next week. And my expectation is that the government's going to go through the usual process of flinging money at all sorts of things. The first thing that would be in my mind is, what are the priorities for spending here? How can we do rorts in car parks and all these other things that we know about and not invest in the kinds of things we're talking about? We've got to hold our governments to account for what they do with our money, which is actually held in trust for us all. And I don't think we've done sufficient to hold them to account for what they spend as priorities. The second part of it is they often allocate money to solve problems, but they never follow up. I know there are people in Lismore who were affected by the floods in 2019 who still do not have access to the relief they were promised. So the money gets allocated as though we've solved the problem. But frankly, no one goes out and checks that on the ground this is actually happening. So, we just got to change this and hold our governments to account.
Richie, just quickly to you, we've already seen massive public subsidies towards coal and in particular gas in recent years. Are we expecting more of that in the budget? What's the government's priorities in terms of spending? Is it investing in solutions or otherwise?
It won't come as a surprise, Ebony, that I think we'll have a gas-fired budget here. We're going to see more money for fossil fuels. We've heard numerous announcements over the last few months. Even I think just yesterday, Minister for Emissions Reductions Angus Taylor was announcing additional support for gas exploration. Through the research of the Australian Institute, we uncovered over $10 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies at the federal and state level. Just one fuel subsidy at the federal level was larger than the Australian expenditure on the Australian Army in that 1 year. So these are huge subsidies that are being offered to continue the fossil fueled addiction that Australia has, and we can most likely expect more of that in the budget.
Well, that just reinforces my view, Richie, that at this election, we the voters really do have to take our vote seriously. I think, what we hope our voting community will do is ask serious questions of every candidate about what they are going to do to try and deal with climate change consequences. Because we just can't go on fiddling around on the periphery of these issues. I understand that fixing legacy infrastructure, for example, is not going to be cheap. It is going to involve a lot of us, but it's got to be done. Otherwise, we're in the business of having a reinsurance cover to deal with the mess that we've been created. To me, imagine that we'd had what happened in Brisbane at the recent floods, accompanied by a Category 5 storm that blew the place to smithereens, like Cyclone Tracy did in 1974. That would be an unmitigated national disaster. But we got to do something about infrastructure. We're 15, 20 years too late getting on this. So we got to get going on it, and we got to do it fast.
And just to add to the getting too late for it, just I think it was only a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its assessment on the impacts from climate change, the vulnerability and adaptation required as well to respond. And it said the window to adapt to unavoidable impacts is closing and will get severely reduced come 1.5 degrees of global warming, which we're on track to hit in the next decade or so. And so the actual window to make these investments that Chris is talking about is closing as we speak. So we really can't afford to fiddle with our thumbs anymore.
All right, well, we might go now to questions from the audience. I've got one here from Alistair McCulloch, who says, I'd be interested in hearing the panel's view on the extent to which the use across Australia of military and police leaders to lead responses to major challenges, including COVID, not just disasters, is a consequence of the hollowing out of the state and the diminution of the public service capacity over the last couple of decades. And his question is really, can the civil service no longer provide leadership in these sorts of existential challenges? Chris, do you want to take that one first?
Well, I take that one because in 2006, at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, I launched the idea that somehow or another we had to think of ways in better using the capacity of our younger people in all sorts of ways like this. So my take on, let's say, emergency services is there are much fewer younger people in those than there are older people. I know from my time in the military, you don't need a military full of older people because they just don't have the energy, and the endurance that young people have. I proposed a scheme called Aussie, the Australian Universal Service Scheme, matched with individual expectations. And it is a universal scheme for all young people. And in my view, would be not like a conscription method, but an incentivised system. 1,000 points of service by the age of 26 would, in my scheme, give you a passport, get rid of your HECS debt, give you a 5% personal income tax reduction for the rest of life, but you would be allowed to accrue those points in different callings. So some might go to the military and some might go into aged care homes. Some might go into emergency services. Some might go into some kind of Peace Corps activity now. But here's the really interesting thing. I've done 12 focus group with Australian young people. And you know what? provided it's universal, they do not have a problem with it. And I also include in my universality differently abled people. So I see no reason why people, who are differently able couldn't be employed in a scheme like this as well as everybody else. So I think it could be a fantastic scheme. Now, I didn't dream it up by myself. It came out of a conversation I had with the president of the Swiss Federation in the Sydney Olympic Games. I'd asked him if he was going to be in Sydney for the closing ceremony, and he said, no, I'm going to go home and do my national service. And I looked at him and I said, but you're only the head of state. And he said, I'm also Swiss and I do my national service. It makes me feel Swiss. And I thought to myself, well, maybe we could have a scheme in Australia that makes us feel Australian. Why not? So maybe there's a possibility with this scheme. I don't know whether it would have good legs or not, but wow, that could make a real difference to our national life.
It certainly could. And Richie, Chris made the point earlier that the SES, the RFS, we do rely heavily a lot on volunteer service in this country. But just to that idea of the hollowing out of the public service, and Alan Beam, also on staff here, has talked a lot about the fact that we securitise everything and bring in, defence and police and military leaders to solve heaps of problems. But, like when it comes to a pandemic, it was a bit shocking to me that we had to call on those, the military to run the vaccination. Shouldn't our health department have been able to do that? I mean, how much of a role is there for the public service in being better prepared, preparing the community to respond to climate?
It's the essential role. And it wasn't just the health service. Like the health service had to call on other public servants. So I know of colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs who ended up going and working in the health space during the pandemic. So gutted has our public service become. And you see this over and over again, like when the decision was made to build a COVID recovery task force, the COVID-19 Commission, instead of appointing public servants or those who have served Australia over the last few decades, the corporate sector was called upon, and you had a gas executive come up with a gas-fired recovery. Yeah. So over and over again, you see the public service being told to just do what the executive government want and to not provide ideas and to not provide that kind of advice and expertise that we, I think, are missing. And that's one thing you want to see, like the budgets for the consultancies that are now being contracted to do a lot of the services that the public service used to provide just continue to climb year on year. And I think it's ridiculous. We need to be investing back in the public service. That's the role of a government. And if that means having a big government with a big public service, then that's what we deserve because we can afford it. And instead, the money is going to consultancies and we're being left here without the skills and the capacity to respond to the dangers we face.
It worries me that we don't have the skills in the public service that we ought to have. The talent is going to go elsewhere if it's not kept inside the public service doing meaningful work. I mean, it's a ridiculous proposition to hollow out a public service because they are there to serve the community.
And you see it across the board. You can pick any department, any agency, and you can point to it. I mean, I witnessed firsthand the aid agency, the Australian Aid Agency, being demolished and sucked into the Department of Foreign Affairs, and many public servants with decades of experience in helping our neighbours on their development pathways just leaving.
The next question I've got is from Peter Penn, who says, is it time to have the national government move to a war cabinet to bring together a whole of government urgent approach for national security and other key aspects of climate change? Which I think has been proposed by a number of experts. Chris Barrie, I imagine the Defence Force would have, being the Chief of the Defence Force, would have given you a fair bit of insight into that type of leadership and what's required to approach really wicked problems. What's your response to that?
I think that's a really terrific question for a number of reasons. But when I started to vote, way back when, of course, I guess the idea was you either voted with the sort of Liberal Party, Country Party, or the ALP, and it was about the two-party system. I've had to reflect on that over time as both the parties have really changed a great deal. I've spent the last year talking to parliamentarians as part of the Security Leaders Climate Group, and I would be really impressed, really impressed, if we could put into the next parliament a lot of independent women. because in the conversations that I've had with independent women in the last year, what really stands out, one, they're very highly committed to their seats, to the people who live in their communities. They're very highly committed to them. Two, they talk together a lot. You know, women are good at talking to each other, much better than men, in my experience. But the women in our parliament, they do talk together a lot. Three, I think they would understand the agendas that need to be run. And of course, they might end up holding the balance of power in the next parliament. And that wouldn't be a bad outcome. I know for years people have argued, you've got to vote this party or that party or else. Well, I don't know. I think that maybe getting a lot more independent women into our parliament would be a fantastic result in the May election.
And Richie, we've certainly seen a move away from the major parties and towards minor parties and independents. And, no party has a monopoly on good ideas. But to this idea that we do need kind of a whole of government approach that works together to solve the problem, not with one department, making it worse and another one trying to fix it at the same time. How important is it that, this is a priority of not just the climate change department, but all departments in government in the next parliament?
This is a key one. At the UN level, when negotiating these national adaptation plans, a key element of it was that it had to be based as a central agency. It had to be directly connected to sort of the leader's department or the leader's cabinet or the leader's secretariat. It couldn't be put to the side in the Ministry for the Environment or the Department for the Environment or some other line agency. It had to be a central function of government. Otherwise, you weren't going to get the changes you needed, because climate change impacts everything. You can't point to a single sector that wouldn't be impacted by what climate change has to offer. And therefore, you need that power to reside in the middle and make sure that it flows on elsewhere. That climate change is integrated into every decision that's made in the health or in the education or in the Treasury. And hopefully, if we do go down the path of undertaking a comprehensive national risk assessment, that would be based out of the Premier and Cabinet.
And can I go back for a minute to the War Cabinet idea?
Yeah.
I think I'm highly attracted to the idea that a ruling party made up of the best talent in the parliament would be a terrific thing and maybe essential for delivering over the next 3 years what we really need. So it's not about which party you belong to, it's about the talent you bring into the parliament. This might actually have some legs to it.
Chris, I've got a couple of questions here that touch on a few things in Ukraine, which are not necessarily climate linked, but it's a big issue at the moment. So I've got Cheryl Cooper here, who's interested to know what you think about the announcement that Australia is sending coal to Ukraine. Will that be helpful? And I guess overall about Australia's response to helping Ukraine and what we can provide them.
Well, I suppose it will be helpful to provide some source of energy for Ukraine. I've no doubt that the Russians will be playing with the energy mix and trying to do the worst that they can. Frankly, I spent an hour last night involved with Chatham House inside the presidential palace in Ukraine. I don't think there'd be many surprises as to what I heard apart from this. The claim that 76% of Ukrainians are supporting what its government is doing. And given the last 4 weeks, I think that is a really meaningful outcome, because what it's telling me is the old equation that I know, that when you are an invading force, it's not like you are being invaded. If we think about Afghanistan, they saw off the Soviet Union in 10 years and they saw us off in 14 years. And guess what? Afghanistan now is still in the hands of the Afghans. Imagine in Ukraine, if they are really committed to their culture and their identity and where they see themselves in the future, the Russians are going to find themselves owning a really big problem, even if they think they can occupy the place. It won't go away, because Ukrainians, being the invaded country, they will make it nasty for them all the time. As this unfolds, it's going to be fascinating. I think for us in the West, and I think there are some big meetings in Europe this week to decide the extent of additional support Europe could provide to Ukraine. There was a big plea last night about providing air defence over Ukraine and no-fly zones and all of that. But one of the big points the Ukrainians put forward was, you may think this is just about Ukraine, but it's not. And they mentioned a whole list of rim countries, frontline countries to Russia, which might also be part of the grand plan. So, this is a very big issue for us all. And of course, here in Australia, we've got our eyes on China and what it meets by then. If you look at what's happening in the Chinese stock exchange, you'll see it's already having a significant impact.
The other question that I had that relates to Ukraine is more climate related. It's from B. White, and he says, can we learn from Russia's action in Ukraine about moving to energy independence? And in particular, because Australia imports most of our petrol, our reserves are held in the USA, and also, of course, Europe is heavily dependent on Russian gas, for example, and has plans to decarbonise. Richie, I might come to you first and then you to respond, Chris, about that idea of energy independence and how important that's going to be.
The federal government undertook a review of Australia's liquid fuel security. That is, how reliant is it on foreign oil? And it found in April 2019 that Australia has only 20 days worth of petrol and diesel at its current consumption rates at any one time. The final version of that report was supposed to be released at the end of 2019, and we still haven't seen it. But really, since then, Australia's become more liquid fuel insecure, with more refineries shutting down than it was a few years ago. Basically, there's a real opportunity. And yes, the lesson learned here is Australia should become energy independent when it comes to its transport fuels. We could be making all the fuels we need to power our cars and our trucks with sun, with wind, and with hydro. If we electrify our transport, we get ourselves off foreign oil. But unfortunately, all the efforts that have been made around liquid fuel security are around shoring up more supply, securing reserves in Texas, rather than actually demand side in reducing our reliance through electrified transport, or even improving the efficiency of our vehicles. We have some of the most inefficient cars in the OECD because we don't have standards on the CO2 coming out of the tailpipe. So there's so much that we could be doing here. And it's the same thing with gas overseas. The lesson learned here is to get off gas, not to try and dig up more. And Australia has no shortage of gas. We went through this yesterday. 80% of Australia's gas is exported. We tripled production on the East Coast and prices went up. You don't have to be an economics professor to know that there's something wrong there. It's that we're shipping it all out for very little income. And as a result, we're paying more for the things we need gas for. The best solution is to get off gas. And if we do that, every household could save. I'll finally end with the positive because it's almost always negative. If we did electrify our homes and our cars and put panels on our roofs, the average Australian household would save $5,000 a year. That's the opportunity that's available to us by actually becoming more energy independent. But it's one that needs governments to back in so that we and everyone can take that journey.
Yeah, it's a wonderful segue for saying at the ANU, of course, we've been beating this drum for a very long time. But we're seeing the impact of having a transport distribution system based on fossil fuel in prices. As the price of fuel goes through the roof, all those other options that Richie just talked about, harvesting the sunshine, harvesting the wind, doing the smart stuff, electrification of a railway system that needs a huge improvement in its capacity, and so on. And these are what I talk about, the legacy systems we really need to work on. When we just need to do a lot better. We live in a very big country with very few people. These becoming very important things, but that dependency on a few days of fuel can cripple this nation overnight, no doubt.
I have a question for you, Chris, from Graham McClay. He says, has climate change been factored into Australia's defence planning and preparedness?
In truth, it has been factored in, though probably not as significantly as it ought to have been. And I think the current CDF, General Angus Campbell, has announced now he's looking at the structure of the Defence Force to see whether a change is necessary. And that's a terrific idea. It's about 12 years after they did it in the UK and the US, but nonetheless, it's still a terrific idea because it means we're going to get something done. So things are going on, and we should always remember that our defence bases are subject to the impact of climate change like everybody else. So, we've got airfields that are going to be under a metre of sea level rise. We've got some places we'd probably prefer not to be in, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it has to be factored in.
And I imagine the military might have a pretty big petrol bill for its fleet of
We are a fossil fuel-based defence force, make no mistake about it.
I've got a couple of questions here, again, that go back to the idea of all of our volunteers. So Amanda Lamont says, I understand the military need a break, but so do our emergency services volunteers, and that we've known for a long time that all of these impacts were coming down the line. Chris, if defence and emergency services are exhausted and overcommitted, going back to this idea, who is left to respond?
Yeah, look, I think this is a big question, and I don't have a crystal clear answer to this. And I understand about our emergency services needing a break too, because the work they do is demanding. Make no mistake about that. It requires high levels of energy and organisation, and so on and so forth. And commitment, to be honest about it. But the Defence Force is in a similar situation. When I was living in New Delhi many years ago, I remember having a conversation with the Chief of the Army Staff there about a riot that had taken place in a city in North India where the troops had trashed the town. And he made the point that a Defence Force that isn't doing defence tasks, but spending all its time on other things like internal security and so on, loses its mojo. So when you recruit people into a defence force, they're there to do a particular set of tasks associated with dealing with the nation's enemies. That's why they're there. That's why they give their service. To start using them in all these other ways does sap the energy. And I'd hate to see the day when the mojo of our defence force has been sapped by doing all these other tasks. So I think we have to find a better way. This is another priority effort for post the next election.
And the next question that I've got, I guess, follows on a little bit from that in terms of priorities. Diana Killen asks, and Richie, I might send this one to you first, as part of an Australian climate change adaptation plan, what's the top priority action to safeguard security? Oh, she says of our water resources, but what's the top priority action?
It's interesting because you can't help but think about how badly we've bungled up the Murray-Darling Basin, which if you look at the way that the water levels have been allocated, they're based on assumptions that assume that water levels that we received in the past will just carry on forward in the future. So it hasn't factored in. It was one of the most interesting things that Marion Slattery, I think, mentioned to me once, is that they didn't factor in climate change in terms of how precipitation, how the water flows would change. And yet now we have, all these dire situations that continually crop up every summer. In terms of securing water, which I think is one key part of the picture, even when it comes down to a very visible and problematic asset like the Murray-Darling Basin, we haven't nailed that, let alone at large across the entire country. The first thing first, you have to do a risk assessment at the national level. The federal government has to take responsibility for it and has to spend the resources. When I was with the Department of Climate Change in 2009, I did a stint in the adaptation section, which was actually starting to pull together the plans to do this. We knew about this decades ago, and we should be acting on this now. And it requires actually centralizing that area. Back when there was a Department of Climate Change, it had three focus areas: mitigating emissions, reducing emissions, which was going to be through a carbon price, doing the international negotiations, and adapting to the unavoidable impacts. There were the three pillars of the Department of Climate Change, and they all work together. If you didn't reduce emissions enough, you'd have to adapt more. If we didn't have an international agreement, then you'd have to do more of both individually. And so all three things were interlinked. Now they're all in different departments. Now they're all being handled separately by different ministers. And you have this real mishmash, this real absence of leadership, which is, I think, why we wanted to call this webinar, a climate for leadership, because at the end of the day, it feels like that's what we're missing.
And I just make a really important point, because it was about water security. Water is fundamental to human life, and it's fundamental to the production of our food. So the management of our water our fresh water is really, really important. And the problem about not factoring in climate change consequences we're going to have water scarcity in some parts of Australia. For example, Tasmania in this last summer had its fourth lowest rainfall recorded since 1900. And yet up in the northern parts of Australia, we had enormous tropical rain downpours. And so matching where we go on our water security to where we've been is a really important piece of work. Now, I can't speak to the priorities coming out of the Climate Security Risk Assessment Plan. What I can say is at least where you know the vulnerabilities lie and you know what might be required, you can start to set up priorities, you can start to allocate resources, and you can start to get something going. At the moment, we don't have any of that.
The next question I've got is from John Englert. He says, I'm not sure I've pronounced that right, John. Hopefully I have. Many municipal and shire councils are proactive in building community resilience and adaptation to climate disasters and climate mitigation, but on very limited budgets. His question is, should they be funded by other levels of government to support their work in this area, perhaps as part of a national climate adaptation plan? Richie, that might speak a little bit to the climate disaster levy that you were talking about earlier, but how important is that there's, the people doing the on-the-ground work have the least ability to raise funds to do it?
Yeah, no, it's the local government association across Australia have raised this. They're responsible for something like 25% of public assets and yet only really pull in about 5% of public revenue. And so they've got this huge responsibility with very little resources to respond to it. But they're called on as a first port of call because they're there closest to those, those councillors live in the area, they're feeling these impacts and they want to best respond. So there is this disparity, and we've seen a lot of interest. We've seen mayors come out in support of this climate disaster levy. Really, if we can find a way to tax polluters for the pollution they're causing, for the climate change they're causing, then the first area that we should fund is local government responses, both to the impact, but then also to help with their preparedness. That would be the best way to use that money we raise, taxing fossil fuel exports and feeding it back into local governments.
And of course, local government areas are about communities, and it's communities that are affected by the impacts of climate change. And that's why it's really important. I happen to know, because I work with someone who did a lot of the climate change adaptation plans for local government authorities, that every local government authority in Australia has a climate change adaptation plan. But when I've been involved and asked them about how they're getting on with it, the plan sits on a piece of paper. It lacks funding, as Richie has just pointed out. But just as we're saying we need a new approach to deal with the risks of climate change, it just seems to me we've also got to think about innovation and change when it comes to how we fund some of these things. You can't simply say to the ratepayers of a shire or a council, you guys are going to have to pay for all of this. I mean, there has to be a different way. And maybe this approach to have a levy is one of them, but there might be other avenues. And fundamentally, it's going to come down for how we set the priorities for what we want to do after the next election.
Chris, the next question is from Sandra Geitz, who says, in your view, is the federal government approach to others' adaptations, i.e. the Pacific nations, local government and the rest, just a way of avoiding the major issue of climate change so that we can continue with business as usual? And her question is, what do you believe is the main reason for the government being missing in action, as you've termed it?
Well, that's a good loaded question. The first thing that I teach in all the leadership stuff I've ever done is that leaders have to walk the talk. So what happens in Australia? We go into the Pacific Islands and we have a step-up program. We're going to solve their problems on climate change by recommending all sorts of things we're not doing in Australia. You don't have to be real smart to get that. You don't really mean what you're saying. You just hope we'll go away or something like that. So walking the talk is part of it. And secondly, real leadership cares about people. That's why I talk about Brad Banducci and what he did with Woolworths. Going out there, being up in the Northern Rivers and South Queensland days before the federal government was there, looking after his staff, looking after his supermarkets, making sure that stock was getting through to the supermarkets where possible, and so on and so forth. That is leadership in action. And that's what I think has been lacking with all of this, leadership in action. I find it stunning that after the Black Summer of bushfires and now the pandemic and all the floods, we still haven't learned that lesson in this country.
Richie, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think Chris nailed it on that one. It comes down to leadership at the end of the day, and you get the leaders that you vote for, which is why it's so important that people use their vote properly, and why there's a contest of ideas as well. And hopefully with the additional independence, with the additional interest off the back of another climate impact, we might actually be able to have this conversation and have the ideas come out of it.
Chris, we've only got a few minutes to go. If you've got a message to everyone watching again today, do you just want to repeat it there?
Well, I will, Ebony, take the opportunity to say to everybody, as far as I'm concerned, the vote I cast in May is the most important in my voting lifetime. And I think all of us as voters ought to question the candidates standing in our seats. We ought to make sure we're trying to get the best person into the parliament for our seat, and hopefully we'll get better answers out of the next parliament. But, if we voters don't take responsibility for getting the outcomes we desire, then I think we are missing in action too.
Thank you very much, Admiral Chris Barrie and Richie Merzian, for your time today. Thank you all for your amazing questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but that was a really wide-ranging and fabulous discussion. Thanks in part to your wonderful questions as well. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are completely free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is on our website at australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _NTT. Richie Merzian is at Richie Merzian, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing from Holly Forrest. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.